What is every Resident Evil game's biggest problem leading up to Requiem? Resident Evil 0 is a very difficult game to play for many people now, and why is that? It's because the game removes the series' traditional item boxes and instead lets you drop items anywhere in the environment. In theory, that creates strategic planning. You're mapping the space and deciding where to build supply hubs, thinking ahead about what you'll need later. It's a very bold change, especially for a prequel that wants to be harsher and more survival focused than the earlier entries, but in practice it's extremely frustrating. Classic Resident Evil inventory management creates pressure in the moment. You're choosing what to carry because space is limited, but you know a storage network exists. In 0, that safety net is just gone. Instead of being clever about planning ahead, it just feels punishing for not predicting what's going to be there. There's multiple points in the campaign where you need specific items. The hookshot is the most infamous example, and if you left it behind in a room far back, you're not making an interesting choice. You're backtracking through already cleared hallways to retrieve something you couldn't reasonably anticipate needing again. The two character system makes this even more awkward. Billy and Rebecca share resources without sharing magical storage space, which means you're constantly juggling ammo, healing, and positioning. Who carries what? Do I leave Rebecca here and bring Billy forward? If I split them, am I creating more backtracking later? There's moments where the dual protagonist design is actually pretty clever with some puzzles, but these moments don't mean as much when the inventory logistics dominate your thinking here. Instead of thinking about enemy placement or puzzle logic, I'm just thinking about where my items are, and it's just not satisfying at all. The pacing really suffers here because Resident Evil works best when the tension comes from limited resources and controlled spaces. In 0, that just comes from inefficiency. There's always going to be backtracking in Resident Evil games, but it is just brutal here. And it's made even worse by the fact that the environments aren't designed as tightly as something like the RPD in Resident Evil 2, and it just seems like padding here. I understand why Capcom wanted to go for this different style here, but I never want to see it return. Going back to the original Resident Evil, and there's obviously a lot of rough edges here, being that it's the first game in the series and being an early 3D survival horror game. You may say the fixed camera angles are the issue, you may say the clunky controls, and those are both valid. I'm just gonna go with combat here because it's just straightforward to the point of minimalism. You literally just aim, you shoot, and you just hope the zombie goes down. There's no real layering behind managing distance and conserving ammo. Enemy variety is limited for much of the game, and boss encounters are simply functional rather than being pretty intricate. The first boss is literally a snake that moves in predictable patterns, and later bosses just add scale without any complexity. Like Plant 42 just occupies larger space. Might have been groundbreaking in 1996, but in hindsight, especially if you've played later entries, you can see how thin these mechanics are. And this also ties into the controls, which I mentioned. Tank controls and fixed camera angles are deliberate design decisions, and a lot of people do prefer this over the typical third-person action camera, but it also is extremely clunky, and some of the shifts here can be very jarring. Like you'll line up a shot and then the camera shifts, and suddenly your spatial awareness is just off. Some will argue that adds to the survival horror aspect of this game, but there's a difference between intentional vulnerability and just control awkwardness, and the original sometimes blurs that line. There are things to love here, but there's really no reason to go back to this with the Resident Evil 1 remake, which many consider to be one of the best remakes in gaming history. This game of course laid down the rules for the series, at least some of the games in the series, but if you look at this without nostalgia, the combat just feels really off here, as well as some of the other things that I mentioned. Before I continue, I just want to explain how I'm doing this a little more. I'm just going over the main series games, remakes, and the Revelations games. No spin-offs that feel nothing like Resident Evil, so even though Resident Evil 6 feels nothing like Resident Evil, it is a main series game. I'm also just basing all these off my opinion, so feel free to disagree. Now subscribe and comment what you're looking forward to in Resident Evil Requiem. The Raccoon City Police Department is one of the best locations in any video game period. You move through it and memorize its shortcuts, you see everything it has to offer. It's just brilliantly designed. It seems like every hallway becomes familiar in a different way after you clear it, and keys are pretty smartly hidden here. And besides the actual game design, it's also just a really cool looking place. But then you hit the sewers and the interconnectivity shrinks. The layout becomes more linear and segmented, and instead of mastering a complex building, you're just going through these series of corridors. There's of course still puzzles and encounters, but it just falls off a cliff, and this will be a recurring theme in the Resident Evil series, where you start off in a fantastic location and then it starts to go downhill. This part of the game just felt like a slog to me. Do I think it's the worst thing ever in the Resident Evil series? No. And also may just seem worse because it's coming right after the RPD. Besides that though, it shares a lot of the same issues as the original, but is a little more refined. There are reasons to go back to this instead of the remake if you're a big Resident Evil fan, but it definitely can be rough for someone who hasn't played this game to start with this rather than one of the remakes. 3 is often remembered for one thing, and it's literally in the title, Nemesis, but the system that shapes how you actually survive every encounter with him, and everything else in the game is the dodge mechanic, and to put it simply, it's just not good. So the dodge in RE3 works like this. Press the button at the right moment before an attack lands, and you'll either sidestep or perform an emergency dodge that puts distance between you and the threat. It's a skill-based system that does reward timing, and while that sounds great, it creates two very different games depending on whether you understand it or not. Players who master their timing can feel untouchable. Players who don't find the game game punishingly difficult because so much of the encounter design is built around the assumption that you can dodge consistently. The core problem is how inconsistent the dodge window is. Unlike a dodge system with a clear visual or audio feedback, like the parry in Resident Evil 4 Remake, RE3's dodge does not clearly communicate when it activates or why it sometimes fails. You can press the button at what seems like the right moment and still take a hit. That inconsistency makes it hard to genuinely improve because you're never sure if you mistimed it or if the system just didn't cooperate. Over time, it just gets very annoying. Something else I actually considered putting as Resident Evil 3's biggest issue was that it just feels like it has a smaller scale than its prequel, but I also don't think that's necessarily an issue since the game is very well designed, so I am just going with the dodge here for now. Code Veronica is ambitious in a way that I actually admire. It pushes the series towards bigger set pieces and more elaborate environments, while also having a more character-driven story. You go to some crazy places here, like the base in Antarctica, but the design doesn't always support that ambition cleanly, though. The backtracking in Code Veronica is just exhausting because the environments are large, without being interconnected well. In 1 or 2, when you backtrack, you're often unlocking shortcuts, or recontextualizing familiar hallways. In Code Veronica, though, there's stretches where you're simply running across large spaces to retrieve one object, kinda like in Zero, and like with that, the pacing just stalls here. Instead of a tight loop of risk and reward, you just get long stretches of traversal that don't change the space in any meaningful way. One of the worst examples is the fire extinguisher. Claire uses it early in the game on Rockford Island to put out a fire and retrieve an item, and the game naturally directs you to leave it behind. Hours later though, when you're playing as Chris in Antarctica, you need that same extinguisher to refill it and put out another fire to access the optional magnum. If you left it in a security box instead of a proper item box, you can't get it back. You need to plan for this hours in advance with no indication it's coming. Then there's the character switch situation, and this is where the design can genuinely just punish players. The game features mandatory character switches at key points. If you didn't leave enough resources behind for the other character, you can just walk into a situation where progress becomes extremely difficult or borderline impossible. The most infamous example is the Tyrant fight on the plane with Claire. If you didn't conserve enough explosives or grenade rounds, the fight can be nearly unwinnable. Then there's a Claire to Claire switch later in Antarctica. The game doesn't warn you that Chris will suddenly have access to Claire's item box, so if you kept all the best weapons on Claire's person when the switch happens, Chris starts his segment empty-handed. The game just doesn't clearly signal these moments. If you're playing this on a replay, it's not as bad, but most people are only going to be playing this game one time. This is a game I think desperately needs a remake, and I think we are getting one in the next couple years most likely. Now on to my favorite Resident Evil game. I hate having to find issues here, but of course, like with any game, it's not perfect. Instead of using traditional tank controls, it has over-the-shoulder camera and combat design, and it did influence the entire third-person action genre. The village opening is still one of the best introductions in gaming. Also, maybe the best quote in gaming history is here.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Then the castle builds on this and is a lot more theatrical. You have some more creative enemy types, there's a lot more spectacle here. For 2/3 of the game, it definitely is more action than survival horror, but it also has a decent balance. But then you reach the island and the shift is not subtle. The enemies become way stronger, mounted turrets start to appear, and encounters lean way harder into arena design. The horror isn't gone here, there are regenerators which are a perfect example of the game having some more tension, but overall, the island just really ramps it up here. The pacing changes here too, because earlier sections do give you some breathing room between intense sequences, and the island just compresses everything into encounter after encounter and spectacle after spectacle. It can be exciting, especially on a first run, but also is kind of jarring. The island also removes environmental mystery in a way that's hard to ignore. The village and castle have more distinct atmospheres, and then the island is just a lot more industrial and just doesn't have the same mystery. Like, yeah, the labs are cool, but it also feels more generic as there's been labs in other Resident Evil games, when the first 2 locations just felt really unique for the series. I don't think the island is horrible. It does have some cool moments, but just compared to the tension of the first 2/3 of the game, it's easily the part I look forward to the least when I replay this. So this was a pretty easy choice for me here. 5 is a very divisive game. I know a lot of people genuinely love this game, and I know a lot of people just hate it. It basically tries to be a faster, louder, more spectacle-driven Resident Evil 4. The camera and shooting system is built directly on Resident Evil 4, and the controls are better here. The enemy crowds are larger here, the environments are a little more open. When you play in full co-op, which is clearly how Capcom designed it, it can actually be a really great time. The inventory is split into real-time grids. You could revive instantaneously if your partner reacts, and the combat in co-op can be pretty fun. The problem surfaces though the moment you play solo. Your AI partner shoots, heals, and follows commands, but it doesn't think like a human would. It consumes ammo in situations where restraint would make more sense, and it sometimes stands in dangerous spaces you would instinctively avoid. Because the game is tuned for 2 people, those issues start to compound. You're basically just babysitting your partner's inventory if you're not playing co-op. Now, of course, there are other issues for Resident Evil 5. It does go more action heavy, it doesn't really feel as much like a survival horror game, but I think it can still be good on its own there. And if you are actually playing with another person, this game actually is pretty solid in my opinion. I actually would like to see this get a remake because I think there's a lot of untapped potential, and I would hope Capcom can make the AI a lot better now. For Resident Evil 6, the issue is everything. Okay, maybe not everything. I don't think this is the worst game ever made like you would think it is. Like, the action here for what it is not bad. You could roll, slide, shoot from the ground, chain melee attacks. Like, you have a lot more mobility here. But this game is just kind of a mess and just does not feel like a Resident Evil game at all. If Resident Evil 5 didn't feel like a Resident Evil game, then this is just in a whole other ballpark. Capcom designed the game with 4 interwoven campaigns, each with a slightly different tone. And while that may sound expansive, it just becomes pretty bloated, and this game just takes way too long. Instead of one tightly paced arc, you get multiple long storylines that overlap and stretch the runtime significantly. There's constant cinematic interruptions, quick time events, scripted sequences, explosive set pieces. The pacing here is just all over the place because you're pushed from helicopter crashes to collapsing buildings to multi-stage boss fights with very little room to breathe. Earlier Resident Evil games, even when action heavy, maintain some of the vulnerability that you would expect from a survival horror game, but in 6 you're often in these big environments with hordes of enemies, and it just leans fully into blockbuster action. While the horror elements aren't completely gone, they're just completely diluted here by the sheer volume of action design. I don't even necessarily think that the biggest flaw is that it just chose action, but it's that it chose everything. It just tries to do way too much, and like I said, ends up feeling all over the place. And remember, this is the last time we saw Leon in a mainline game, until now, so I'm glad this was not his last adventure. I really love Resident Evil 7. It's a game that got me into the series, and it really brought the series back to its roots. After getting more action-oriented in pretty much every game, it just resets and goes back to the claustrophobic survival horror Resident Evil game that we hadn't gotten in a long time. It also, of course, makes the shift to first person to make you feel more claustrophobic. Also, unlike other games, you're not a trained government agent, you're just an ordinary guy looking for his wife. The opening hours inside the main house are some of the most focused horror the series has ever delivered. Jack Baker stalking you through tight hallways, exploring dim rooms with limited ammo, so the sense of not fully understanding what you're up against. It's some really great design. The problem starts to emerge once you settle into the game's combat rhythm. Outside of boss encounters, the primary enemies are variations of the mold heads. They differ slightly in behavior and durability, but functionally they're almost exactly the same. You're not really adapting to any radically different enemy archetypes, you're mostly just doing the same thing. In earlier Resident Evil games, even when enemy pools were small, they were at least distributed in some ways, like there was the dogs, hunters, lickers, parasites. In 7, once you understand the mold heads' behavior patterns, the regular combat just becomes very predictable. It doesn't ruin the experience because the atmosphere still carries the weight, and this is not a horror game, so the combat clearly isn't the focus here, but the lack of enemy diversity here is definitely a weakness. Then when the game shifts locations later from the main house to other areas of the estate, and then completely different locations like the ship, it kind of has a similar issue to Resident Evil 2, where the early game locations are just far better. Pacing definitely starts to unwind here a little bit. Now this never collapses the way that 6 did, for example, but the best hours of this game are certainly the first few. And now on to, for now, the most recent main series game. Village is another divisive game, and I personally do like it, but I do think it's a more flawed game than 7. Instead of focusing on more tightly controlled environments like its prequel, it divides itself into distinct thematic zones. This Casa Dimitrescu was one that was showed off a lot before the game released. House Benevento is the one true psychological horror part of this game. There's a reservoir section which emphasizes creature design and has more environmental hazards, and then the factory has a lot more action. Individually, many of these sections are pretty strong, and some, like the House Benevento, are exceptional in my opinion, but the issue to me is that the game doesn't feel as cohesive as it could have. It feels like it tried to be a mix of Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7, and in some ways it does succeed, but it also can feel pretty jarring. The variety is impressive here, but the transitions can be pretty abrupt, and as you go from place to place, you're just in full-on action sequences with the Lycans, which in itself is not an issue, but especially later on in the game at certain points it gets a little ridiculous. And then I'm not going to spoil it here, but there's some moments that don't even feel like they're part of this game. Honestly, one of my favorite parts of Village was the DLC, because that felt a lot more Resident Evil. And before I move on, I actually did consider the story as one of the big issues. I think there's a lot of interesting aspects here, but it also just feels like a complete mess. There are some pretty crazy retcons here, and is it all over the place? Yes, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't kind of like the story here. The 2002 remake of the original Resident Evil is often held up as one of the best remakes ever made, and that reputation really is earned. Basically expanded the mansion, added new areas, introduced Crimson Heads, and did a lot more with the atmosphere as this game was capable of much better graphics and controls, but still kept what made the original a pioneer of its genre. It's a very meticulous game, and that does come at a cost. It's one of the slowest paced entries in the franchise. The movement is deliberate, backtracking is constant, inventory management is very heavy here. Even by survival horror standards, it's very methodical to a degree that can be oppressive. impressive. Early in a playthrough, the density of the mansion here is actually incredible, but as you do start to slowly loop through the same corridors, even with shortcuts unlocked, the design expects you to retrace your steps frequently, but there's just a lot of slow aspects here, like the doors. If you've played this game, you know what I'm talking about. The Crimson Head system, where defeated zombies can resurrect, is a cool idea because it forces you to think ahead about which enemies to permanently eliminate. It also means that backtracking can become even more stressful and time consuming. I think this is one of the weaker issues in this video, because I don't think it makes this a bad game at all. I think that it's not even going to be a problem to a lot of people. And just a side note, I've seen a lot of people say that this game should be remade, and while I wouldn't be against it, I also don't think it necessarily needs it. I'd rather see Code Veronica or 5 remade before this, because for me personally, I definitely do prefer the traditional camera angles, but I do think it would be cool to have a choice between the traditional tank controls and the more modern controls. Moving on to the remake of 2, this really kicked off the remake era that we're in right now, and in my opinion, this is the best one. It did a fantastic job modernizing the original's core structure. The RPD looks better than it's ever looked before. The over-the-shoulder perspective, like I said, is something that I prefer. Mr. X's stalking pressure can add pressure here, and I know there's issues with that. He really seems to love standing in the library sometimes. But anyway, atmospherically and in terms of control, it's a great reinterpretation. I don't think there's many issues in this game, but I think a big one is how it handles the zapping system. For those of you who don't know, in the original 1998 version, it's basically where actions taken in one character scenario could influence the others. It was perfectly executed, but it created the sensation of two overlapping campaigns interacting with each other. The remake does retain A and B scenarios, but the interconnectivity is significantly reduced. There are, of course, pretty much the same key story beats, but the difference between the campaigns is a lot thinner here. Instead of two tightly interwoven perspectives, it's more like two variations on the same structure. You'll still get character-specific moments, but the sense that you're playing two halves of a larger, dynamically effective narrative is just kind of gone here. The remake is superior in many ways, and I personally do like it better, but it did simplify what was one of the original's most ambitious ideas. There also are subtle pacing shifts tied to this. Because the campaigns share more overlap, replaying them can be more repetitive, and there is a little missing content here, but it's not as bad as what I'm getting to now. The 2020 remake of Resident Evil 3 controls well, it looks good. The dodge system is much better here, and on a pure gameplay level, it's consistent with the foundation built on the RE2 remake. Problem isn't how it plays, it's simply how much of the original was just cut. The most noticeable weakness is scope. The original 1999 version wasn't as architecturally dense as RE2, but it still allowed for more extended city exploration and branching moments. Capcom trimmed that down significantly in the remake for some reason. Entire locations from the original games are either shortened or removed, and the campaign moves at a much more accelerated pace. Instead of slowly navigating a collapsing Raccoon City, you're more propelled through a tightly guided sequence of events. The structure basically comes across as a straight line rather than a web. The Clock Tower, which was a multi-floor location with puzzles and backtracking in the original, is reduced to a single courtyard for a scripted boss fight. Raccoon Park is gone entirely, the Dead Factory at the end is replaced with the Nest 2, and basically just resembles what you just saw in the RE2 remake. The remake just leans heavily into the cinematic presentation, and it was very interesting, but also doesn't hit the same when the game is like 5 hours. Nemesis is another major factor. In the original, he functioned as a recurring threat who could interrupt exploration more unpredictably, but in the remake, his appearances are more scripted and heavily tied to set pieces. Instead of being stalked, you often sense that you're entering a designated boss arena. The game is polished, and I don't think it's a bad game, but it was just missing so much content, and it seemed like maybe we were going to get DLC for it, but we never did. I understand it can be very hard to play the original games now. I think they've definitely had issues with aging, so if you do just play Resident Evil 3 Remake, just understand that it is missing a lot of content. The 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4 is technically impressive. Combat is probably the best we've ever seen, and enemy behavior is more dynamic here. Capcom reinterpreted the environments with stronger atmosphere and a darker tone. It refines what the original established. Now, this is a very personal one for me of what I think the biggest issue is, so you may disagree. But the original Resident Evil 4 walked a strange line between survival horror and being extremely campy. And yeah, most of the Resident Evil games are campy, but this just took it to a whole new level. Leon's one-liners, the exaggerated villains, the ridiculous set pieces just gave the game such a distinct identity. Like, it was self-aware without becoming a parody, but then the remake deliberately changed that. Leon is a lot more subdued here, and the humor is toned down. The dialogue is less exaggerated too, and the villains are just treated more seriously. It gives it more of a horror experience, but it just trims away on so much of the personality of the original. Then for some of the villains, Salazar is still eccentric, but he's no longer cartoonishly theatrical. The remake has humor and charm, and of course they had to keep some lines, but the balance is just different here. For some people that may make it a stronger game, and this is far from an objective issue, but one of my favorite things about Resident Evil 4 and why it's one of my favorite games of all time is just because of how funny the dialogue was and how over the top it felt. But I will give Resident Evil 4 Remake credit. There is better character development here, like Luis is definitely a lot better here, and also Leon does this for some reason. This is honestly the reason I prefer the original over the remake. I do want to touch on both Revelations games a little. So for those of you who don't know, the original Revelations was originally designed for the Nintendo 3DS before being ported to other consoles, and we do have to take that into account. On 3DS, slower movement and tighter quarters made sense because the hardware and control scheme favored that, but when you played on console, especially after 4 and 5, the overall feeling of this game and limited mobility really stand out. Classic Resident Evil is slow too, but the difference is in encounter structure. Revelations frequently throws you into arena-style fights or boss encounters that lean more towards action rather than the original trilogy. Enemies can swarm and bosses have wide attack ranges, yet your mobility options remain pretty rigid. The repositioning can be extremely sluggish. It becomes even more noticeable in repeated hallway encounters with the Queen Zenobia. I actually do like the ship setting here, I think it's a great atmosphere, but over time the loop becomes more predictable. It seems like you just enter a corridor, then there's enemies, you clear it, move on, and with it feeling so slow, the pacing just kind of flattens. Now this movement system may work for some games, but for what Revelations tries to be, it definitely is pretty noticeable. Capcom released Revelations 2 episodically, and that decision directly shapes the campaign's rhythm. Each episode is designed with a clear stopping point, often ending on a cliffhanger, and in isolation those endings work, but when played as a complete package, which is how most people experience it, the momentum here just does not feel that good. The best entries in the series build dread gradually, and really work hard to immerse you, but then Revelations 2 repeatedly resets that immersion. The recap screens appear, episode titles reframe progress, and the story structure becomes across as more segmented rather than continuous. Even if you binge the episodes back to back, it just feels like it was built in parts. There's also the partner system to consider. Unlike RE5, this is asymmetrical co-op. One character typically handles firearms while the other provides support abilities. It's an interesting idea, but playing solo, the AI partners just come across as passive and just too simple. They aren't horrendously incompetent, but they don't really add much strategic depth either. Then there's the raid mode in the game, which is actually the best part for a lot of people. And when you have a side mode overshadow the main campaign, that's not exactly what you want. And there it is, my biggest problem with every Resident Evil game. Now there's a couple of these I'm not entirely sure on. Like I think for the original you can try to find some other issues. And you may ask why I'm not including some games. The multiplayer games and some of the other spin-offs just have completely different issues that don't even feel like traditional Resident Evil issues. So this is the first Resident Evil video I've made on the channel, and if it does well, I'd love to do more. This is one of my favorite series, and with Requiem coming out, I feel like there's a lot more content I can make on this. Maybe I'll make an updated version of this when Requiem comes out, and maybe I'll change my mind on some of these. If you think that there's bigger issues in some of these games, let me know in the comments. If you did enjoy and want to talk more about Resident Evil, consider joining my Discord and subscribing. Thank you for watching.